the nature of population policies, and what are the measures that have been taken by the government of India to control population change. In the last class, precisely we discussed about the population theories. So we discussed about pre-Malthusian theories, Malthusian theories, and we also discussed about demographic transition theories and optimum level of population theory, and so on and so forth. And in this class, and we will be specifically discussing about the population composition and change in India, right? So, what is the population composition and change in India, and why there is a change in India since independence, and what are the changes that have been uh, occurring over the years, and we'll be trying to understand in this present class. So, as regards the population composition in India, so generally the population composition generally indicates that it refers to the structure of population based on various characteristics that could be age, gender, class, caste, region, religion, the migration, literacy, education, and so on and so forth, and including sex ratio. So all these factors plays a huge role, in trying to define the category of population composition. So as precisely when it comes to Indian context, and we'll be discussing at length in the present class. So as regards the age composition is concerned, and generally in social demography, in the population theories and population as a subject and demography as a discipline. So as regards the population age composition is concerned, and generally it is divided into three categories. The age population of the population in a society is divided into three categories. The first category is called the 0 to 14 years, and which is considered as a young population. And the next one is the 15 to 59 years, and which is considered as working population, and 60 plus years, and who are conveniently called as elderly population. So India has a large population, youth population, and which is often called a demographic dividend. And because since India has a huge youth population, and who are in between 15 to 59 years, and therefore that category, that process of change that occurring in the population composition is called demographic dividend. So increasingly increasing on the other hand, when it comes to the Indian context, and there is also an increasing in elderly population that indicates aging trends in India. So this is one type of composition category when it comes to the population composition. So that is age composition. So the next one is that, and we have sex composition. So that is called sex ratio. So generally, the sex ratio is measured as a number of females per thousand males. It is measured as number of females per thousand males. So India's sex ratio has historically been low due to, as we know that there are a lot of gender bias and female foeticide and unequal access to healthcare, and so on and so forth. However, there are the recent improvements, and with the launch of the government programs, policies like Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, all these policies are actually encouraging the female child in Indian context. So this is one type of another type of sex composition. So sex composition means sex ratio. So it is measured as a number of females per thousand males. And the third category could be is that the literary and education. So this also plays a huge role in trying to define the population composition of any society, and even particularly Indian context. So as regards the literacy and education is concerned, Um, and as we see that, since independence, the literacy rates has steadily increased, and there is also gender gap in literacy still exists, but is of course it is narrowing down, because as we see that, that girls are now shining in every result. Whenever there is an examination results are out, generally the girls shine than boys. That indicates that, there is also the gender gap is in literacy is a little bit narrowing down. So that's a good sign. However, there is a lot of challenges ahead, because there is a preference is given to the males, in availing the education, and still there are a lot of homes, particularly in rural areas, and due to the enforcing of gender bias and stereotypes, and girls were not given proper care to have education, to access to education in Indian context. So I think that affects the gender gap in Indian context. So generally, the education affects the employment and fertility rates and the social mobility. As you know that, when suppose if you have a good education, and obviously the educated person and would go for employment, so the would go for employment. Of course, if there is no suitable employment, that leads to unemployment. That's again intention. But it also leads to the fertility rates. For example, a good population education will have a good positive results on the fertility rates, and because it dictates the terms and conditions of how much line spacing should be there between each children, is also matters, with a positive indicator from the population education. And social mobility is of course, and those who are educated, they tend to migrate from one place to another, and also it also indicates the social mobility, because a son of a auto rickshaw father, and the suppose if the son is educated, and obviously the social mobility in that family will be high, because education plays a huge role in trying to define and change the status of social mobility of the person. So, and there is also the another category of population composition is the rural urban composition. And as we know that, majority still lives in rural areas, but urbanization is increasingly rapidly. And there is also growth of cities due to migration, industrialization. There is also the rise of megacities and slums across in India, particularly major cities such as Hyderabad. So another category that defines the population composition is occupational structure, and due to the policies of the Indian government, and due to the also the role of technology and education, and there is also shift. There's a paradigm shift from primary agricultural sector to secondary and tertiary sectors, and there is also the many people now who are educated are now shifting their careers and occupations from the agriculture to secondary and tertiary sectors. And there is also sector, and there is also gig economy. And as we see that, particularly when it comes to the Hyderabad as a major city, and we find a lot of youth and who are engaging in gig economy perspectives. And that the majority of them that who are not remaining, who are unable to find a suitable job, and they're finding their avenues in trying to in gig economy platforms such as Swiggy, Zomato, Uber, Ola, Rapido. So all these factors, platforms are providing an employment, at least a part-time employment for them to meet their economic requirements. So this gig economy also plays a huge role in trying to define the characteristics of population composition. So, and the sixth category could be is religions and social composition. Yeah, because the religion, and India is known for that multi-religion and multicultural society, because India is a land of major religions such as Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Sikhs, and and so on and so forth. And there is also the as regards the caste-wise is concerned, and we have SCs, STs, and other backward classes in India. So this also defines the population composition. in Indian context. So, what are the major changes, that have been there in population change in India? The population change generally refers to the increase or decrease in population size over the time. And the major components of population change includes the birth rate, that is called natality, the death rate is called mortality, and migration, and so on and so forth. So, as regards the trends in the India's, the population growth is concerned, suppose if we observe that, friends, in the last class we discussed about demographic transition theories, right? So suppose if you apply such theories to Indian context, we find that, pre 1921, era, that, there is a stagnant phase, because there is also high birth rate and, high death rate. And because, at that in pre 91 1921 period is considered as a frequent, is considered as the period of frequent famines and, epidemics. And, there's also a lot of people died, because of lot of epidemics and, famines in India. So there is also stagnant phase, because that phase is considered as a stagnant phase, because there was a high birth rates, as well as there was a high death rates also. And from 1921 to 1951, this phase is considered as steady growth phase. And in this phase, and, this phase is also known as the year of great divide. 1921 is considered as the year of great divide. It's because that after that there is a steady growth in Indian population. Until that time, there was a stagnant phase, because there was a high birth rates and high death rates. But after 1921, that's called year of great divide, because there is a steadily growth of population in India. And that's primarily because that, there was a decline in mortality due to the emergence and development of healthcare systems in Indian context. So therefore, there was a steady growth of Indian population between 1921 to 1951. So that period is called steady growth. That period is called steady growth. And the third phase is called, then from 1951 to 1981. So this is called the population explosion. And, as we see that, the population had doubled, in Indian context, and it rapidly increased due to the advancements of in medical healthcare and facilities. And it also reduced the death rates, and of course the birth rates remained quite high. So this all these factors led to the explosion in population. There is an increase in population growth. Therefore, the period from 1951 to 1981 is considered as the period of population explosion, because the population got exploded, increased or doubled, tripled, during these periods. And, and what happened, after 1981? Suppose if we see that from 1981, to the present context, there was a declining growth rate. There was a declining growth rate, because that, the government of India in 1981, they concerned more about the population growth in India, because, the population growth generally leads to the tensions in society, because the resources are limited. And if resources are limited, there will be an unequal distribution between population. And when there is an unequal distribution of resources between population, it leads to turmoil and tensions in society, and also it leads to violence in society. So as a result, and, when there is an unequal distribution of resources, that leads to the inequalities between the rich and poor. So the government of India in 1981, they thought that the population should be reduced and you should be controlled in Indian context. As a result, the government of India in 1981 introduced the lot of population policies to control population growth, such as family planning policies, and to control the population growth in India. And it also thought that, education plays a huge role, and in bringing awareness among the people, and that one children is enough, or maximum two children is enough, because small families, happy families. So that's sort of an idea that the government of India at the time yeah, took that message among the people. It spread across various stratas of society, right? And also the urbanization also played a huge role in trying to affect the population growth in India. And particularly, and when there is an urbanization, invariably the people from the rural areas, they tend to migrate to the urban areas in search of livelihood, in search of employment, in search of education opportunities, and so on and so forth. So when they migrate to urban cities are not a city, or not that zones and which give comfort to each and everyone, because urban areas it is very tough for any individual to live and lead a dignified life, because the rents are quite high, and owning a flat is huge burden on the family, and renting a house also is a very huge burden, and maintaining the family in the urban context is very tough. And because all these tensions brought an awareness among the people that no, large families is not a perfect ideal type to have in the urban space in Indian context. So as a result of that, with the educated youth, they started thinking and ponder over the population size, I mean the family size of their respected families. So they went for very small families and nuclear families, and as a result, all these factors, all these thoughts, all this awareness affected the population growth in Indian context. So there is also the fertility trends. As regards the fertility trends is concerned, there is a decline in total fertility rate. So many states have reached the replacement levels below 2.1. So I think so most states in Indian context, they have reached the replacement level below 2.1 total fertility rates. I think that actually affected the controlling of population growth in India. And as regards the mortality trends are concerned, there was a decline in infant mortality rates. There is also decline in crude death rates in India, and also there was an increase in life expectancy. And earlier, now due to the increase in modern technology, increase in availability of resources, I think all these factors played a huge role in increasing the life expectancy of an individual. So all these factors led to affect the population growth in Indian context. And of course, the migration in India also caused a major role in trying to define the population composition and the growth. And as regards the types are concerned, we have rural to urban is the most common type in Indian context. And as we just discussed that, the reasons for the migration is employment, education, better living conditions, and so on and so forth. So when we apply the demographic transition theory to Indian context, India now is in the third stage of demographic transition theory, and that is called low death rates, and of course declining. There is also decline in birth rates, and which is actually causing the slowing down of the population growth in Indian context. So therefore, when we apply demographic transition theory to Indian context, so India is now in the third stage of the demographic transition theory. So, what are the major challenges? As regards the major challenges, as regards the major challenge, key issues and challenges um, in Indian context to control the population growth is that when we see the Indian population, and in fact now in recently in 2023, India surpassed China population. Now India now is now the topmost position who have achieved the population highest population, and which is accounting around 16 to 18% of the total world population in India. I think this is causing a major problem because though India is now uh, I mean going into a transition phase, I think that though we have youth population in India is more, when compared to the older population, and so I think this is the demographic dividend, as we discussed just now, is that the demographic divide, I think, is a major chance to reap the benefits. So unless we address that problem, I'm sure there will be a lot of unemployment issue. There will be a lot of social tensions that eventually will rise, and to tensions in society. So I think a demographic dividend, as discussed, is that it refers to the economic growth potential that arises when a country has a large proportion of working age population, particularly from the age group 15 to 59 years, and compared to dependents. So I think when more people are working and fewer are dependent, productivity, savings, and economic growth eventually will increase. So I think India has that opportunity. Suppose unless we tap that resource, unless we tap that advantage position, I think we cannot solve the population pop problem in Indian context. So what it indicates is that there is a need to create, I mean, the opportunities for the youth in India. So, what are the policy measures for India is required when we have the golden opportunity of demographic divide? Particularly economic measures are very important. It's like the job creation in manufacturing and services are important. There is a need to support startups and the MSMEs in India, because when you have a more startups and MSMEs in India, so the eventually it creates a large pool of opportunity for the Indian youth to start their self-employment schemes and opportunities. And there is also need to have social measures, particularly education and skill training programs. And there is also need to create an woman empowerment schemes to not only create life skills, but also skills that matches to the requirements of the industry to start their own careers. And also there is also need to create a public health care expansion and nutrition programs to address the population growth in India. So I think going by this understanding, one can say is that India now stands at a very critical demographic junction. India is now standing at a very critical demographic juncture. It can be either. It can convert into either as a burden or an opportunity. In other words, the same population can either be a powerful engine of growth dividend, or suppose if it don't tap that advantage, it also leads to a source of crisis burden on the Indian society. So since the outcome is generally depends on the policy choices, investments in human capital, and employment generation. So it all depends on the governments. It also depends on the society, that to have a policy choices and to have investments in human capital and in employment generation. So unless we create such policies, unless we create such job profile, I think uh, we cannot reap the benefits of demographic divide in Indian context. So, friends, and so far we discussed about, I mean, the demographic divide. As we think that, suppose if we don't reap the benefits of window of opportunity that demographic, dividend created. I think it is going to create a huge problem in society, right? So, because there is a labor supply effect is there, and the savings effect is also affects, and human capital formation also affects, and also women's economic participation also affects. So unless we create such avenue, I think India is now going into a very dark phase, because unless you don't create, right? So there will be a problem. There will be problem, because India is now currently a one of the youngest nations in the world, one of the youngest nations in the world. So the median age could be 28 years as per the latest census. And over 65% population is in the working age group. I think that is a window of opportunity for Indian government to think and ponder over how to reap the, take the advantage of the demographic divide. And I think there is a need to create employment opportunities. There is a need to expand IT and service sectors. There is also need to expand the gig economy and digital platforms. I think unless you do that, I think it's going to affect majorly in Indian context. So, friends, I think this is very important. So, because India, since India is having a very good opportunity, I think there is a need to transit. There is a need to change the policy in terms of paradigm shift from divide into divide into a golden opportunity, right? So suppose if you don't think about think about in terms of golden opportunity, it is going to be turned into a burden if jobs are not created, if education does not match market needs, and and if education does not match market needs, there is going to be a huge unemployment issue, and inequality increases, and governance of course fails, and it leads to the tensions and turmoil and violence among the youth in Indian context. So just taking the example that countries in our Africa, they are experiencing youth bulge without employment. So what is a youth bulge? Your youth bulge is that, suppose if the youth remain unemployed, what they do, if the youth remain if the youth remain unemployed, they tend to indulge in a lot of violence, isn't it? They tend to indulge in a lot of crime activities, antisocial activities. So that when they remain unemployed, that phase is called youth bulge. That phase is called youth bulge. Suppose if there is a youth bulge, there will be more tensions in society. There will be more tensions in society. Therefore, there is a need to think and ponder over it. There is a need to think and ponder over it. I think unless we do that, unless we address it, I think I'm sure that it's going to be a burden on the not just on the families of the youth, but also it's going to be a major burden on the society in itself. So, friends, there is a need to create economic policies for the youth in India. Particularly, there is a need to promote, as we discussed, there is a need to promote, manufacturing startups such as Make in India. There is a need to support MSMEs and startups. There is a need to encourage the labor-intensive industries, who can offer and address the employment issues in India, right? So, and along with that, there is a need to have social policies. As regards the social policies are concerned, there is a need to create universal education, Skill India mission, and women empowerment programs at large, and to address the demographic divide in Indian context. Friends, so in other words, that India is now stands at a very critical demographic crossroads, very very demographic crossroads. Um, very demographic crossroads. So, because India's present demographic movement, as we discussed, is that which is described as a once in a generation window, and a phase where the country has a new, large, young, and potentially productive population. So, this is what makes it a critical demographic crossroads, because the same structural advantage can either accelerate development or deepen existing problems, right? So why this movement is critical? Why this movement is critical? Because the India is currently in the third stage of the demographic transition theory, where, as we experiencing it now, is that where birth rates are now declining, death rates are also low, and of course the working age population is also expanding, right? This creates a temporary window where the dependency ratio is low, where the labor force is also large, right? So now here we have a potential for rapid economic growth. However, this window is a time bound, right? In the coming decades, India will begin to age, right? Just like many developed countries. If the current opportunity is missed, it cannot easily be recreated. So India will begin to age. It means what? India will begin to age means that whoever is in the youth age, now they are also turning into old age. The age process comes. Age doesn't stop, right? So whether you create employment or not, age doesn't stop. The time period, and which is now, it's just goes on. So as a result, the present youth is a old age population for tomorrow. So the whatever the working age population we have today is going to be the old age population for tomorrow. Suppose if we don't address today, there is going to be a huge crisis tomorrow. Something like, that's why this movement is called a critical phase to address. This movement is called a critical phase to address. And this youth population is absolutely a historic opportunity, for Indian government. And because India's youth bulge offers multiple transformative possibilities, there is also it offers the economic growth engine. A large workforce can increase production, it can expand markets, it can attract global investments, right? So it also gives a rise to the platforms for innovation and entrepreneurships, and where the young population tend to adopt new technologies faster. They tend to drive startups and digital economies. And it's certainly a global advantage for India, because as countries like Japan and many in Europe age, India can supply skilled labor globally, because we have a huge population, right? Huge population, working age population. Whereas the other developed countries, now they are suffering from lack of working age population, because they have a old age population is more, but they have a working population is less. Suppose if Indian youth is being trained properly and given the skill training programs to match to the requirements of the industry needs, and the youth in India can also supply their labor globally to various countries. So it can become a human resource hub. It can become a human resource hub. So this opportunity is certainly a not automatic, I'm telling you, because the demographic dividend is conditional, and certainly it is not guaranteed. It is conditioned, because a large youth population does not automatically translate into growth. Of course, it does not automatically translate into growth unless you give, and without supportive systems, it can create pressure rather than progress, right? So therefore, there is need to create supportive systems to address the challenges of the demographic dividend in Indian context. So there is a need to the risk of turning into a economic burden, demographic burden. Suppose if you don't address it, so what will happen? There is an increase in unemployment. There is also increase in underemployment. So millions of youth, they enter the labor market annually. So it's because that there is also lack of adequate job creation, which is leading to frustration, informal work, economic insecurity. And there is also, if you see that, there is also skill mismatch that is occurring in Indian context. So education often does not match industry needs. So graduates may remain unemployable because they lack the skill sets that require to the requirements of the industry needs. So this leads to social instability as well. So because the idle population can lead to crime, they can indulge in anti-social crime activities, protest, and political unrest in India. So there is also the persistence of inequality, because the benefits of growth may remain concentrated, the marginalized groups may be excluded from this whole process. So there is also the gender gap, particularly the low female labor force participation reduces overall productivity, right? So what it requires is that the transformation from population to productive force depends on human capital. So that is education. The education is not just a literacy. So far we discussed that, and we understood that having a literacy population will lead to economic growth. But that is not now sufficient today. So what is sufficient now is that along with the literacy, what we require is that quality education. There is a need to focus on the critical thinking, digital skills, and vocational training programs are very much needed to address the gaps or skill sets among the Indian youth today. And there is an also need to think about all these skill set programs, from industry oriented training programs, the lifelong learning and adaptability programs. Without this, population remains numerically strength but not economically strength, right? So friends, the importance of governance and policy also matters a lot, because the effective governance determines the outcomes of a good policy plan. A long-term plan, demographic planning is needed to address the challenges of demographic divide. There is also need to have a regional balancing, that is north versus south, which is now happening in India. So there is a need to have a regional balancing of the population, and there is also need to have institutional capacity programs, because efficient educational programs will lead to stronger labor markets, right? So friends, therefore, India's demographic situation is a double-edged sword, right? The large youth population can drive economic transformation. Suppose if we don't provide the certain opportunities, and it creates structural crisis, and the difference lies how effectively the state and society invest in human capital, generate employment, and ensure inclusive governance. In essence, the population becomes a dividend only when it is developed, skilled, and productively employed. Otherwise, it remains a burden, right? So therefore there is a need to address the demographic dividend issue in Indian context. Friends, I'll stop here. So in the next class, we'll be discussing more about the population issues and challenges of population growth in Indian context. Thank you.